Okay, I think we're getting ready to start. All right, it's the 05 mark. I'm gonna just give intros. Some of y'all might know him, some of y'all might not. This is my friend Ryan. Ryan Stenberg runs a company called West Egg Realty. They've been crushing it for the last 2 years. I've seen them grow dramatically and build up a $50 million portfolio. That being said, I know people wanted to talk about triple net projects, and so this is the time to sort of get into that space, especially as people are transitioning out of multifamily. So without further ado, Ryan's going to give us a rundown on commercial triple net and industrial products. And then he has a project that he's got that I think the SIR community might be interested in later. Also, obviously, disclosure, he owns the property. So, still do your due diligence just in case. All right. So Ryan, why don't you start us off in terms of how you guys got started, and then talk about number one, which is how to buy commercial real estate.
Cool. Thanks, Nelson. So you can hear me all right? I'm on a hotspot right now, so I'm hoping it translates well. Okay. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. I will go into an example project in a bit and talk about also commercial real estate, but a little bit on us first. I work with a couple partners. Some of you may have met Abe at Sericon as one of my core business partners, and a couple other guys. In the last few years, we bought about actually a little bit less than $40 million worth of real estate. It's probably worth between 50 to 60 at the moment. And then we've kind of transitioned over that 2-year period from the multifamily or single family or small, duplexes, triplexes, to multifamily, to then commercial real estate. And since then, we've done industrial, hotels and motels, office space, retail, mobile home parks, almost every asset class out there. We've done at least a project or two on. And so we've been kind of working our way towards commercial, and now that's really where we found kind of a home, and I think we'll probably be for a long time. So there's a lot of perks and a lot of upsides and downsides to commercial real estate. So Nelson asked me to come on and speak to some of those and just kind of walk people through maybe what some of the key differences are, and how you buy, how you manage, and just what some of the risk reward trade-offs might be. So with that, I'll go ahead and share a screen. I got a presentation to kind of walk everyone through those at a high level. None of this is going to get super detailed. It's just going to be kind of the high level trade-offs, why we chose commercial real estate over the last 2 years and kind of kept moving this direction. And then also how to do some quick evaluations and what to look for that most people don't look for when they get into this world. So first off, just between residential and commercial real estate, what are the key differences? And I want to define each of these first. And for the sake of this presentation, and I know this is not what a bank would say, or if you're looking at an income-based approach of assessment of value, but for this presentation, when I say residential, what I'm talking about is where people reside, where people live. So that means single-family homes, multifamily buildings. When I say commercial, what I'm referring to is industrial, retail, office, basically where you would operate a business. And so that's the key distinction I'm making here. And commercial is, that's what I'm referring to in this presentation. And so there are a lot of different words out there. People kind of try and capture some of the same concept. So you might hear triple net properties, you might hear commercial properties, you might hear, industrial or retail or office or things like that. And so that's what I'm kind of grasping here. So this is on the right, you can see basically, this is like a big industrial warehouse that we own, and there will be businesses operating out of these buildings. So with that, I want to start with the why, and then go to how we evaluate or how we kind of assess what to buy and whatnot. And so I want to talk about why commercial real estate. And the first, all three of these are actually very closely related. They're all related to just basically supply and demand, and thinking about who is buying commercial real estate and who is selling commercial real estate. And so our first the first item that we look to a lot is that commercial real estate just has a lot less competition. So if we used to be in the multifamily world, and before that we were in, buying duplexes and triplexes and whatnot. And what we found is as you kind of progress along that spectrum, the amount of competition for hungry kind of value add or even scrappier people is very rare. So when we used to do a lot of for those of you who've seen any of our kind of presentations before, we used to do a lot of our outreach for acquisition through texting. And so we would text blast to the magnitude of hundreds of thousands of people, and go after, kind of have conversations with tons and tons of sellers, or tens of thousands of sellers maybe, and that would whittle down to the properties we buy. And in the multifamily space, we were never the only ones doing that. There was always competition. There were people, messaging, cold calling, sending direct mailers. Same thing with single family homes. But in commercial real estate, we're probably realistically like the only group that does that at large. And that is because there's just less competition. So you'll see like the picture down below is just a lot of people walking through the residential housing. And we found that this is true, in single family homes for kind of more maybe emotional buying to do it for a primary residence, but it's also true in the investing world. And I would think probably bigger pockets over the last few years for driving a lot of that traffic and demand towards residential real estate, but not yet towards commercial real estate. And so we try to stay away from competition. I guess Peter Thiel would say competition's for losers. And so we want to walk away from competition whenever we can and just buy what's easy and has lots of value. So the next item on this is very closely related as well. Actually, sorry, I'll walk through some examples really quick, because actually this is really important, just modeling out how this works in reality. So when because it's easy to say you don't want to compete with others, but why does it work mathematically to your favor? So if we look at commercial real estate in the market, like in the marketplace as a whole, let's say that of all the buildings that exist in the US or America today, let's say that they could be, if they were filled up and fully tenanted and they had no deferred maintenance, they could be worth 100%, of potential value. But today they're sitting at 50% potential value. And that means that they're not all fully tenanted. There's an occupant, there's a vacancy kind of across the market. And then there's also deferred maintenance across the market. And so let's say that the value extracted might be 50%. This is a made up number. It has no data, no data behind it. This is for the sake of proving a model. And let's say someone is going in there and they're doing a value add every 15 years, every building gets picked up and someone does a value add project to that building. So every 15 years, that doesn't mean a trade happens every 15 years and something gets sold and purchased. It means that someone comes in to add value, take a vacant building, for example, rehab it and fill it with a tenant or something of that nature. Let's say that happens once every 15 years. You might see the market for commercial real estate stay roughly the same. So you would see the market, maybe if the buildings were capturing 50% of the value, they might still be capturing 50% of the potential value at the end of that 15-year cycle. So if we were to look at residential, what's happened, and again, I will honestly attribute a lot of this to bigger pockets and a lot of the demand that they've generated for residential and multifamily. There are other reasons as well, but I think it's the internet at large. And so you might see those same buildings turn 3 times in 15 years. In fact, I've seen buildings that turn even faster than this. So they will have 3 people come in and add value all within the span of, say, 5 years even. I've seen it happen where someone will come in and they'll redo the kitchen, and the next person will come in and they'll paint the building, and the next person will come in and do something else. And eventually you're trying to add value when you can only go from maybe 80% to 100%. And so you're really cutting the margins thinner and thinner and thinner as there are more people in competition for the value add segment. And so this is the main reason that we stay in commercial real estate more than residential real estate, is that you tend to find projects with more meat on the bone, and you tend to find projects with more margin, and margin is what creates, 1, your upside, but 2, your safety. And so we like to stay in commercial real estate a lot. And again, I'm talking about industrial and retail and things like that, because there's still a lot of opportunity out there where that building hasn't been touched in 50 years. That's really common. Nobody's added value to that building in 50 years. And so we can come around and pick up those buildings. So that's item number 1. 2 is closely related to this, the less competition. It's kind of the other side of the coin, but I believe there's an uneven amount of institutional buyers in commercial real estate. And so what I'm comparing this to is commercial real estate versus residential. And so in commercial real estate, we find that institutional buyers, and that might be your REITs, hedge funds, or even private equity groups or other capital groups, they are frequently the buyer that you would sell to at the end of the day in the commercial real estate world. In the residential real estate world, that might not be as frequent or as common, but the best buyer to sell to is the buyer that is really well capitalized and just wants the most stable thing they can get their hands on. Something with a long lease, and that they don't have to think about for a long time. And the reason for that is that they need to buy so much and place so many dollars that they have to buy a lot of volume that can scale kind of operationally. And so they have to buy things that are really passive and are not a job. They have to buy that, but they can buy it for a premium. And so we see a lot of instances, and the reason I have these Pizza Hut pictures in here is I have a buddy that works at a retail REIT, and they frequently will have a building with, say, a Pizza Hut. This is the one that they've been doing very recently. It will go under, the building will go vacant. The valuation was, say, $3 million on the way in when they owned the building. It dropped down to $1 million. They sold the building for $1 million, and then someone retenants it and sells the exact same building back to them. So institutional buyers, they often will actually sell a building for a huge loss and then rebuy it when someone puts the tenant back in there for a huge premium. And so we really like that spread because that gives you the opportunity to be the value add, I guess, opportunistic buyer in the middle. And so that's something that we find that there's a shortage kind of those value add investors in this segment. And the last part is that I believe there's just a high ROI on your effort in commercial real estate. And so I think there's a high ROI on dollars, but what I'm referring to here is actually that in a residential building, let's say you're buying a 100-unit apartment building, you might go in and you might rehab 100 units, and then you might have to lease up 100 units. And that means talking to thousands of tenants and funneling it down to the 100 leases that you signed, and then trying to, and then you have churn within those units. And it is a heavy operational cost to run apartment complexes, multifamily buildings, and single family portfolios. And when you get to commercial, or when you're looking at commercial real estate, many times the buildings are of equal size or of equal value, but you might have 1 or 2 or 3 tenants. And so the ROI on your effort is often a lot smaller, or sorry, a lot larger. And that means that you may often sit and wait for a tenant or 2, and it could take a long time. But when you find one, it might just be 1 lease that you need in order to fill your building, or 3 leases that you need. And so the ROI on your effort is very, very high. And so that's helpful when you're trying to scale up purchasing and dollar amounts and buy bigger and bigger things. So these are kind of the 3 main reasons that we stick to commercial real estate, or 3 of the large ones at the very least. And with those, I want to then get into just a quick kind of assessment of how you can value commercial real estate. And I would say there's 3 main ways. One of them, I think, is the most common, and it's the most dangerous, and I highly do not recommend it. And then there's 2 more that are the ways that we look at things, and we want at least one of these to be true. So the first, and this is the way that most people buy commercial real estate when they first get into the space, is they're actually buying the lease. They're buying the lease value, or they're buying the tenant value. And don't get me wrong, leases have a lot of value and tenants have a lot of value. When you're doing a value add commercial real estate project, the goal is often to buy, something vacant or low occupancy and to sign leases and to get that, and that increases the value significantly. But oftentimes in commercial real estate, many people are buying a lease. And the dangerous part about buying a lease is that leases often have a 5 to 10 year lifespan in them. And let's say you have a 10-year lease, there's 6 years left when you buy it. In a way, like if the building is worth half of what you bought it for when the lease goes out and the tenant leaves, then you have a massive, effectively depreciation rate every year since you bought this asset. So I'm very hesitant to buy leases. And this is honestly the way a lot of large REITs and a lot of large companies out there, they are buying leases as their main source of value, because they're buying the rental rate and they're buying, the rent in the middle, or the rent that will come out of the lease every month or every year. And that said, I'll kind of get into I already kind of explained why it's a little bit dangerous, but I'll get into what to look at instead. And so often the way that we will look at things instead is that we will want to buy the building for appropriate value. And so buildings tend to have a 50 to 100-year lifespan. And so we will often look at a building and say, would I buy this if it were vacant for this price? And if the answer to that is yes, then you're going to put yourself in a very high leverage, strong position, because you don't care too much if the tenant leaves. If the tenant leaves, it might even in some cases put you in a better situation than you currently are in. And so this gives you kind of 2 exit options, or 2 routes that you can, 2 business plans you can lean into. And that optionality is really important in commercial real estate. So way 1 is the lease, way 2 is the building, and way 3 is the land. And I have in parentheses here, forever, the value is, lifetime value of land is forever. I guess it's not exclusively true. There are zoning and other changes, but a lot of the time out there, if you buy land, say up on the waterfront of, in some state, it's very unlikely for that land to lose its value over time. And so your value is very much, appreciating rather than depreciating. So these are kind of three main ways. And I just encourage you heavily to not buy just for the lease or just for the tenant, and make sure that you have at least one of these other two covered. And I think as long as you give yourself these, kind of two options or two ways that you can evaluate it where it works out in your favor, you're going to put yourself in a strong position as you buy commercial real estate. Okay, so then what do you look for kind of to determine these, if these ways of valuing have been, if your standards have been met, or if you should move forward and whatnot? And so I would say that, again, to talk about what most people are looking at, and I will explain why most people actually look at this, kind of overvalue this metric. Most people are looking at the standing value, so the standing value of the property when they purchase. And so I would say that the standing value is equal to the standing base rent per square foot times the building square footage divided by the market cap rate. And so this is a pretty similar to multifamily investment like valuation equation. And you'll notice that it's based on the standing base rent per square foot. And that is, this is how most people are evaluating. And there's good reason for it, actually. There's good reason that people look at this. And the main reason is that when people come from multifamily, the multifamily world, most tenants out there, to be, I guess, direct, but a little, the tenants out there, you can almost view as widgets, meaning they're all the same. They want the same thing, and they are all going to rent. Everyone wants granite countertops. Everyone wants nice paint, nice, flooring, and there's very little deviation here. But in the commercial real estate world, there's huge deviation between what tenants want. And so if you had a tenant that thought this was the perfect building 5 years ago when the previous lease got signed, and they sign on to a lease, and they're willing to pay a huge premium because this was the perfect building for their business at that point in time, meaning maybe they were looking for growth, and they needed to attract great, talent. So they leased your building at a premium. That may be over market rent, and you might not be able to get that market, that same rent again. And in the multifamily world, that's very rare to kind of have someone overshoot the rent by a significant amount. But in the commercial world, that can happen a good amount. So they can overshoot market rent. And so what you really want to have a handle on in order to understand if you have safety in your purchase is the second item here, which is basically the stabilized value of the building. Or you could also, I've called this the market value of the building. And basically this is if my tenant was to leave and I was to place a new tenant at market rent, what would my building be valued at? And it's this exact same equation. We're just going to use market rent. And so I'm going to rewind actually really quick to the last slide where we're talking about leases and buildings. You can value the property for the lease, the building, or the land. And I'm saying you should look at the building. You should have at least the building or the land to be worth what you're paying for it. And this second equation here is an assessment of the building. Is the building worth what I'm paying for it? If I take market rent and multiply by the building square footage and divide by the market cap rate, am I happy with the purchase if that's the rent that I land at? Because that way, if your tenant leaves, you can re-tenant the building at something you're happy with. And so this is that layer of safety that we're usually looking for when we purchase. So really the only distinction here is the standing rent and the market rent. And so in a multifamily building, you really don't have to be that cautious a lot of the time of what the rental rates, or whether if someone's inflated the rental rate in their building. For example, if you have a 100-unit apartment, the odds that they got 100 different people to pay double in the rental rate than what the market demands it's a very difficult task. But in a commercial building, the odds that someone got the tenant to pay double what the market demands just takes fooling one person. So it's a lot more common. So you have to be careful of the standing rent and just look towards the market rent. And so when you're doing your underwriting, look towards what does the market bear in terms of rental rates. And that's a very important metric when you're underwriting commercial real estate. Okay, so just to summarize all of that, I would say if you ask yourself two questions and you have the answer to both these questions is yes, then you're going to be in a good position when you make a purchase. The first is, am I satisfied with the standing value given my purchase price? And the second is, am I satisfied with the stabilized value given my purchase price? And so these will keep you safe as you go out there and purchase items. And if both these are true, yeah, you'll be in a high leverage position when you have to go renegotiate with the current tenant, or the tenant leaves, and you have to renegotiate with incoming tenants, or sorry, negotiate with incoming tenants. Okay, so I think a lot of this is touching on the the why and then how we look at things. And I want to get on to do an assessment or an overview of managing commercial real estate. Nelson said this is one of the higher items in the polls that were sent out. And so I just want to talk about a common misperception that people have in commercial real estate, which is that commercial real estate has long-term leases and it's mailbox money. And there are circumstances like this, but they are far and few between. This is probably 3-5% of commercial properties out there actually are mailbox money, in the sense that you don't do anything every single month and that you just get a check from the tenant and you never talk to them and your building's perfectly fine regardless. In general, I would say this is not the case, and managing commercial real estate just takes a slightly modified flavor of what it looks like in the residential world. And so I would break it into three main buckets. There's leasing, enforcing leases, and then managing tenant improvements. And between these three things, you're getting most of what you need out of management. And so just like residential, managing commercial real estate, usually you'll hire a property manager or a leasing agent who will help you with each of these items. But leasing often is a lot more complex than it is in the residential space, because you will be marketing out to businesses, then negotiating with those businesses, and you're solving tenant problems. And the hard part is that you're not solving residential tenant problems where, we've all been residential tenants before. You're solving commercial business tenant problems, and you may not have run a manufacturing plant before. And so you're trying to step into the shoes of a manufacturing business or a daycare business or a bar, and figure out what are their problems, what are they going to have an issue with in their business. So leasing does get a little more complicated. So there's usually leasing agents that are specific to that role. The second item here is enforcing leases, which is, again, a little bit more complicated than residential, but it's just a slight twist on it. You'll have the same, kind of tracking tenants down for rent collections. You'll usually have less tenants, but you'll also have, where it's very frequent in commercial real estate, is to have leases that push the expenses heavily towards the tenants. And so tenants they'll pay for their own utilities frequently they'll pay for their own utilities. Frequently they'll have maintenance contracts that they are obligated per the lease to uphold. So it might be, I am going to do monthly service on all of the HVAC units. And so you as the landlord don't maybe have to do that maintenance on the HVAC, but you have to enforce, the tenant does. And you have to keep checking on them and say, send me your invoices or send me your monthly reports. And you may have to agree with them on a maintenance contract. And then you'll have expense chargebacks. And so a good property manager will generally recuperate a lot more expenses than a bad property manager. And so you can actually impact with the same tenants and the same leases in place, a good property manager will actually bring you in a higher NOI than a bad property manager, because they will enforce the expense chargebacks in a better way. And so expense chargebacks can come in many forms, but in general, for example, a triple net lease, which many of you may have heard of in the commercial real estate world, you are able to recapture all expenses. And that includes property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance and repair, and potentially the property management fee itself. And the last piece here is managing tenant improvements. And so in the commercial world, you kind of do things in reverse a lot of the time compared to residential. In residential, you'll go out and we'll buy buildings and multifamily buildings, and we'll rehab 100 units, and then we put tenants in them. And in commercial real estate, we often flip that script. So we will buy a building, it's vacant, we'll wait for the tenant to show up, and it happens to be a bar, and they'll ask for improvements and say, hey, I would lease this building if you can put in new LED lighting and fresh flooring. Okay, we'll say, okay, that's great, we'll put in those things. And so the property manager will come in and manage that commercial build out. So they will manage the flooring being put in as well as the lighting. And so oftentimes you are kind of waiting for the tenant, and then upon lease signing, you kick off all of your building. And so you are, when you're underwriting, you're estimating what types of tenants might I attract and what might they ask for, what might I have to provide. And it becomes a negotiation with that tenant the whole time of, am I going to provide it or are you going to provide it as the tenant? Because it could be either or. A lot of times the tenants will do their own build out. And that also gets in, kind of closely tied into permitting and compliance. And can this business actually, this business that wants to go into my building, are they allowed to go into my building from a zoning perspective or, city or county compliance? So these are kind of the main differences for managing commercial real estate. And I would say that in general, the hardest parts are that you're dealing with many different types of businesses out there, and each one is a slightly different flavor than the other. So they have different incentive structures, different needs and wants. Some of them love short-term leases, some of them love long-term, some of them want build out, some of them want other things. And then you're enforcing those leases back. So this is the kind of roles that usually your property manager or your leasing agent will help you out with a lot. And so then from here, I wanted to get into an example property. This is a property that I own. I and Abe and some of the other business partners that I mentioned. And so I'm going to walk through kind of how you'd look at it from maybe a lease, or looking at it from the lease perspective at a very high level, and then looking at it from a building perspective. And then we'll wrap up here, and I'll kind of shift over to questions. But so the building is 1101 Curtis Street in Monroe, North Carolina. It's a suburb in Charlotte. And it has a tenant, which is McCoy Machinery Co. They are a manufacturing company that makes the machines that make textiles and composites. And so hence the images on the left. And so left on their lease, they've got about 9.5 years left on their lease. They've got 40 years of tenancy in this building. So they've been in this building for 40 years, and they've got 60 plus years in business as a whole. So they've been in business since I think 1964. So this would be looking at the tenant at a high level. And to be honest, a lot of people will just stop, here, plus maybe they'll take the rental rate, whatever the current rental rate is. And I encourage you not to do that, but to look into the building and what the building should rent for if this tenant were to leave. Because despite the fact that they have a lease for 9.5 years and that they are legally obligated to follow through with that lease, something can happen. They could go under, they could go bankrupt. They could find a way out of the lease, given the language in there. And so it is a good safety net to always be happy with the purchase, even if the tenant leaves. And so that's kind of what I'll talk about next. So the building is just a large manufacturing warehouse. It's 64,000 square feet in total. The current rent is $3 a square foot. That's $3 a square foot triple net. So in the commercial real estate world, almost everything is done on a square foot basis. And so you would take $3 and multiply it by 64,000, and that would get you the annual base rent. That comes out to 192,000. The triple net part, as I mentioned earlier, means that they also pay the expenses. That's the property tax, the insurance, and utilities, maintenance and repair, and et cetera. So they also pay your expenses. And then if we were looking at market rent for this building, say market rent based on what's releasing nearby for buildings of this type, it's probably in the $4 plus range. And so if we take all of this, we want to assess, so here's like kind of the CoStar data behind it. And we'll take this and often plug this data into those same equations that I had earlier for standing value and then also stabilized value. And so we'll look at the standing value. And in this case, very simple math. We take the base rent per square foot, we multiply it by the building square footage, and we divide it by that market cap rate. And so we'll derive a building value. And then we'll do the same thing for pro forma value. And we'll usually, because you don't know market rents precisely, we have more of a probabilistic model usually when we're looking at market rent, where there's a mean or somewhere we're likely to hit, but there's really a spectrum of, of where we could land. And so we'll draw out a couple scenarios. So we look at, well, what if it were $3? What if it were $3.50? What if it were $4? In reality, I think there's a good chance of landing above all of these numbers, but we like to look at the spectrum of like, would we be satisfied with the pro forma value of this building if the tenant were to leave and we had to release it? So this is how we look at commercial real estate. I think that a lot of people get really stuck on just the first item, which is looking at standing value. And that's because in the I believe it's because in the multifamily world, that's a totally reasonable place to stop. If you look at the standing value, it's very hard to trick, 100 tenants into overpaying. And it's not even that you're in commercial real estate, it's not even that you've necessarily tricked your one tenant. They may have just outvalued this building a lot more than anyone else because they needed it for their business at the point of time where they signed the lease. So you'd be very careful about just the current lease. And that is a portion of the equation. You want to be happy with the current lease, but you also want to be happy if that tenant leaves the building as well. So I think that's all I got for you. And I can take questions for a little longer than I thought, but yeah, about 30 minutes or so.
Questions. We've got Ronald on the call here. He's a lawyer in the triple net space, and he'll take over the other portion so that Ryan can go off to his football game. But I'll start off with questions if anyone has in particular from the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to jump in. All right. Gwen asks, can you talk more about buying tenants? With residential, it feels like the process is more straightforward. I guess to clarify, how do you find tenants? That's part of the question she's trying to ask.
Yeah. Okay, the standard way to find tenants is to go hire a leasing broker, and that leasing broker will put your building up onto LoopNet, which is like the Zillow of commercial real estate, and they will put up a for lease listing where they have some pictures, and then you can call the broker and you can come in and tour. I personally think it's a terrible way or a terrible place to stop right there, and that's the only thing you do. So there are other methods that we've been using recently and experimenting with. So what you can do to actually attract, maybe 10x or 100x times the number of tenants is you can use LoopNet. You can also use Crexy, another listing site. You can use Facebook ads, Microsoft ads, Google ads, Craigslist ads, and any number of other marketing channels. The more marketing channels you have, the easier you can find tenants, and they'll come in. And then that just starts, the tour. Then you kind of funnel that into tours, and you do a lot of tours and go from there. So hopefully that helps shed some color on the common channels as well as the uncommon ones.
Okay, Lee asks, how do you find out the rents from other similar commercial buildings?
So the best but not great data source, I would say, is CoStar. And I say best because there's not a lot of services out there that have better data, that have more data than CoStar does, but I still don't think it's a sufficient or great service in isolation. So usually what we do is kind of multiple folds. One, we will look at the CoStar data, and that's our first pass. That's actually what we use just to say, do we want to submit an offer on this building? And then we submit an offer. When we get an escrow on buildings, that's when we actually test what market rent is. And so usually what we do is when we're in escrow, we will put up a LoopNet listing for the building, as well as maybe a Facebook ad. And we'll see, okay, at $3 a foot or $4 a foot or $5 a foot, how many hits are we getting? How many people or tenants are reaching out to us? And what are they saying when they reach out to us? Are they saying, hey, your pricing is really high, but I need space, so like, let me come take a look at it? Or are they saying like, this is a great deal, like, let me, when can I sign? And so we will kind of gauge that somewhat quantitative because we can see how many tours and how many leases or how many hits we're getting on our marketing, but also somewhat qualitative in that we're kind of feeling out the subjective success rate of the outreach. And so we want to test market rent that way. So yeah, once we're in escrow, all of our purchase and sale agreements give us the ability to test market rent in escrow.
Gotcha. Okay. And then let's see what else here. Oh, okay. If that's it, I've dropped a link for the project for everyone who's interested. Ryan's graciously given it to us at a 7 cap instead of a 6.5, what market is. That being said, I'm going to let him go off to his game. We're bringing on Ronald Rode here. He's our local lawyer, transacts a lot of triple net, and he can take over on things to watch out for in the lease when you're purchasing and more of the minor details. Unless we have anything else for Ryan, I want to thank him for his time here. Anyone else got anything else to ask? All right. Well, thanks for your time, Ryan. I appreciate it. How can people contact you if they want to reach out to you?
You can just email me at ryan@westaggrealestate.com, or I'm in Sarah. So on the Facebook page, just find me and message me.
Awesome. Thanks again. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
All right. That was Ryan. Give us a presentation on how to buy commercial real estate, manage it, and things to watch out for. when you're purchasing. That being said, we have a real life lawyer who actually knows what they're doing, who actually keeps watch of the leases. Usually, if anyone is a commercial real estate person buys, they actually usually still go through a lawyer that double checks their work and makes sure there's no funny business going on in the leases, which are, again, while it's not the most important thing to buy and to look out for, like Ryan said, it's a very, very important part of how the building gets valued, because most of the buyers are these huge hedge funds and REITs that are looking to buy just based on the lease. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Ronald Rode so he can warn us about what to watch out for. Ronald, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Nelson. Really appreciate the introduction. So, I think you can hear me, right? Is
Yep.
audio good? Okay. Everything that Ryan said is absolutely true. What I would expand on it is that the way to ensure that all of your calculations and your assumptions are correct is by digging into the due diligence. I think I commented a little bit on like buying the lease. I kind of don't have a problem buying the lease. I mean, that's essentially the standard way. A lot of people can't underwrite to have a forever hold or even to have a 50-year hold. And so as a result, you're kind of left with that third leg, which is a lease. You're buying a lease. And that's the kind of the risk that you just have to take with triple net, but with commercial properties. But that said, that's fine. One of the things that I did really like that he talked about was this expense recapture. So as part of your underwriting, one of the key metrics on, say, like an office building or a multi-tenant industrial needs to be, what is your expense recapture ratio? And that is a number, between 0 and it should be between 0 and 100, but actually it can actually be more. If you're recovering over 100% of your expenses, it typically opens you up to an audit from the tenants, but it doesn't change the numbers that you collected. You physically collected more from the tenants than you spent. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle. It's normally a ratio between 0 and 100, and you want to get as close to 100 as you can. But even some pro formas, or actually some financial statements, will have 102% recovery. But I say that because that's kind of like your leakage. That's how much of your expenses, and on a medium-sized building, you're easily spending 200 grand a year on expenses that are recovered by the tenants. And so if you have 90% recovery, well, you can see that's 180,000. That's pretty significant. Certainly to NOI and your own pocketbook. But that's the kind of stuff that I really recommend that people ask their attorneys, or they understand what they're looking for in the leases. Another really popular topic is caps on increases, and not only caps on increases, but recovery periods for that. And so I'll explain a little bit more, but there will be tenants that are very desirable tenants, or if they're in a soft market, tenant who has leverage will sign a lease and say, I'll agree to pay taxes and insurance, but for any controllable expenses, those are subject to a 3% increase every year. If you don't use up the 3% for the next following 5 years, you're able to recapture up to that 3%. So, I mean, Nelson, you're nodding your head. Like, if your base expenses are $100, they go up to 102. You still have $1 in the next year. That if they only go up to 105, you're still able to get that, even if that exceeds the 3%, because you haven't charged it in the year before. Because the tenant basically underwrites, okay, well, my cap, I have a budget, a kitty of $3, of $3.50, $4 every year, and the landlord gets to recover all of that money in the future if they expend it. But that's, I don't know, I would say it's a trap for the unwary, because if you underwrite that you're going to collect 100%, well, it's true, but, and again, you just gotta, there's no solution except to look at the leases, because every single commercial lease is custom. And I guarantee that's true, even if it's a form lease. Even if somebody gives you a property and they say, oh yeah, all of these are the same, it's so simple, it's a form lease, the check boxes will be different, and they will write different clauses in the special addendum and no two tenants are the same. You know, maybe somebody has a personal guarantee on their lease and maybe somebody doesn't. Maybe somebody has a corporate guarantee and somebody doesn't. That changes the value of each lease when you're underwriting it. And again, it sounds complicated, but that's the level of scrutiny that you have to apply if you're quote buying the lease.
On that subject, say I'm a
Yeah.
brand new investor and I'm trying to get into triple net. At what point do I bring you on as legal representation to look over the lease? Is it when I'm shopping the properties, or is it when I'm under contract? I should do my own first pass and then
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I think the best time is either if you're unrepresented, you can bring us in to write an LOI on a property that you like, that you've run the numbers, or if you do have a broker, or if you feel comfortable submitting your own LOIs, bring us in when you have a signed LOI, because we really need to modify the PSA, the purchase and sales agreement, prior to it getting signed. And all of these examples that I'm talking about, most sellers, they're not going to give you copies of the leases until you're under contract. So you won't even have the opportunity to review this until your due diligence, until you're under contract. And so that's the time that we kind of jump into high speed. And again, we allocate responsibilities based on the investor's needs. And I have sophisticated clients that they don't have me look at leases very much. They will pass me one of the more difficult leases and they say, figure this thing out. Tell us what's going on in terms of rent projections or audited accounting. But then I have other investors, that are newer that say, Ron, kind of walk me through this, because we're the kind of firm that we're not just one level of service, I guess. We can do somewhat a la carte and review documents as you need them. Yeah, I think we had a question on the chat. I wanted to.
Someone asked me, what type of commercial is a good place to start? Commercial, office, or shopping centers, office, etc.
Yeah, I think the best place to start is an asset class that interests you, something that appeals to you, that you want to learn about. Because one of the things that Ryan talked about, and I 100% agree, you've got to know the tenant's business. You have to know what solves their problems, what type of real estate they need in their business to help them grow, to help them make more money, right? Ultimately, we're a partner in this tenant's business. It's no longer residential, which is just giving people a roof over their head and a nice place to stay. You really have to understand different industries, different sizes of businesses, whether it's retail. If you have a background in that, I think it's great. I was on a call today with a shopping center owner, and we were talking about the mix, and he was like, yeah, I go into their business almost, every month. It's like a bakery, and we talk about the number one thing that they need is parking. And this is in Dallas, this is like infill Dallas. Their number one need was parking. And so he, as a diligent landlord, is saying, hey, if I'm trying to unlock value, if I'm trying to charge them more in rent, how do I get my hands on more parking? And so he was talking to me about buying or leasing next door space for parking, because that was their number one concern. By far and above everything else, it was parking, not signage, not new bathrooms, not roofing or a sign. It was more parking, so for their employees and customers to like not be crowded. So that's what I would say is, really just try to understand it. Something, and you don't need to know it. I didn't know a ton about industrial before I started investing in industrial triple net, but it was something that I was passionate about and I was able to learn. And that's what you have to do is you have to constantly be learning, because again, I guarantee you the tenant needs of this year will be very different in 20 years. And so you have to kind of commit to that learning process in order to understand where the value is to your tenants. So that's my really long way of saying it doesn't matter. You can make money in any asset class, but what interests you? Where are your connections? What do you know? And what interests you? What do you want to learn? Do you like office? I think office is a great opportunity to buy a 50% occupied building, to put some value add into the common areas, to make it nice, to put on social media, lease it up, get great cash flow. You're buying at huge discounts for office. Retail is tough. I don't love it for new investors because a lot of retail tenants are weak. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you can buy, a donut shop and a nail salon and a coffee shop that all go dark. And that's a pretty bad situation if you buy retail that doesn't have an anchor tenant and they go dark. You're going to be in a bad place. Industrial, I think, is great. Multi-tenant, small bay industrial. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hand holding and decisions, but demand is super, super high. So no matter how you screw it up with tenants, if they leave, more tenants will come in because there's such a demand for the space. But it's a lot of work. So for like I don't buy a small bay industrial because it's a lot of hand holding. But yeah, there's the other one, Nelson. Let me see. Coco was asking, does the vacancy rate affect the valuation of the standing value and the stabilized value? I would say that yes. Anything that decreases the number of months or years that a building is occupied, you have to take that into account. It's just the cash value over the long term. Everybody needs cash flow, especially if you have debt on your property, and so you need to factor in the warehouse, or you need to factor in the vacancy and the lease up times. Let's see. Lee was asking industrials and warehouse. Yeah. Self-storage is its own class. I would not lump in industrial. And again, you'll kind of out yourself as a newbie right away if you consider self-storage as industrial. Self-storage is another one of those, I would say it's like a bridge product. Certainly there's institutional capital. Certainly there's a lot of people doing big things in self-storage. But the thing with self-storage is that it's not a triple net lease. You don't have sophisticated tenants, and self-storage is a business. First and foremost, it is a business with employees, with turnover. You're going to have to do SEO, marketing. And I don't want to be discouraged. Some people want to do that type of work, and some people want to buy the mom and pop self-storage and push the facility towards full automation and contactless check-in, which is great. I absolutely encourage that. But at the end of the day, you cannot get around the fact that it's a business. You've got to have somebody boots on the ground that's reliable to go put eyes on the property, as much as you have automated door locks. And again, I'll be candid, like I have clients that put in remote access to the self-storage units. It is incredibly expensive. I mean, it's like $6,000 or $7,000 a door, depending on your Wi-Fi signal, your Ethernet runs, all of this stuff about updating the locks. It is not a simple thing to just put wireless locks on a storage unit. What happens when they malfunction? Who's going to go out there when you have an angry customer that says, my lock's not working, I can't get in? You've got to have that fail safe. And again, that might be a full-time 1 or 2 employees, but how do you pay them? How do you run payroll? How do you pay their state unemployment taxes? There's just so many things that are different than, say, a comparable multifamily or a comparable triple net building. Self-storage is not industrial, but it's a great asset class in and of itself.
Ronald, how do you know what the market cap rate is? I can actually give a quick showing on this also.
Yeah.
But there's more than one way to figure it out. The problem is it's not like Zillow where you have a million other homes that look exactly the same in the neighborhood where you can use comparables for it. You usually have to go on LoopNet to see what other people are transacting for. But you don't really necessarily know because most of these leases are private. So someone has to call and figure out what the actual lease ended up being when it rented out. And that includes a sale price too. Most of the time, you don't have to actually report how much the building sold for. So the only people who know is this company, CoStar, because they actually hire people to call the brokers and the tenants in the transaction to figure out what the true value is. And the only other people who would know are brokers in the market who transact multiple buildings. And typically that's the other way people figure it out. Cushman & Wakefield, for example, is one of them. You might be able to figure out the reports. Most of these companies, Cushman, CBRE, they have a market report for every individual city. So this one, Charlotte, for example, this was the one Abe and Ryan's building is in. I was looking at some research earlier, but it's got a 1.6% vacancy cap rate. right? So that means, like Ronald said, if the tenant leaves, someone just comes in and you'll just fill it up, no problem. Absorption is how many of those square footages are used, and then, asking rents, etc. So you can figure out pretty quickly how much the market's changed by looking at some graphs, but they usually also show the comparables of what different buildings sold for in a specific market. So, for example, Charlotte's split into different neighborhoods, but you can tell here that, um, Ryan was trying to rent it out for $4 per square foot. If you look at the weighted average rent for, pretty much every market, it's north of $4 within Charlotte. So if they rent it out for $3 and they still make good money, that means the building will still rent out for more if this tenant leaves, and then you need to fill somebody back in. And so that was one of the things that they mentioned when you're looking at the market. Usually they have reports like this that you can use to estimate, will I be safe in the scenario where a tenant leaves? Because then I, as the landlord, have enough margin to push leverage on the tenant that exists. Same thing with key transactions. Okay, so the building 60,000 square feet, it's not comparable to these 150,000 square feet ones, but you get to sort of see what's currently moving quickly in the market. And it seems like a lot of large, commercial corporate owners are trying to buy into the market and use the same warehousing space. So this is Cushman and Wakefield. There's plenty of other reports and sites that you can check on to do comparables for. But that's kind of where they're going for. Okay. How do you check cap rates, Ronald?
Yeah, same way. I have relationships with brokers in our local market. So I feel like they're more generous sharing it. I do use brokers if it happens, but again, the brokers don't really have a lot to gain if you've made it clear I'm not necessarily going to buy your property. They would rather have the conversation with us so that they could maybe buy or offer something off market. So again, it's chicken and the egg, but I think if you can establish yourself with a portfolio or even a single purchase, brokers will talk to you if you're a nice guy and you just like chatting. And again, I understand it takes some credibility. It's like, we have over 100,000 square feet here in DFW, and that lends itself to some credibility when people are just like, yeah, I'll talk to this guy because I like hearing what he has. And maybe he's thinking of selling something and we can talk about pricing or, yada, yada, that sort of thing. So that's the way I get it, kind of through osmosis. But again, it's different too. I guess I'm in the industry. I'm only buying local. I'm only buying one asset type. And so it's easier to just kind of chit chat with those guys. But
Got it. How do you qualify for a loan if the building is vacant?
yeah, I'd say it's tough. I think it's very hard. Even say like an industrial, smaller building in DFW with a super low vacancy, it's definitely harder. You're going to get low LTVs if anything, and probably the kicker is always going to be your balance sheet has to cover the balance of the loan. They're not going to feel comfortable if they can't recover from a personal guarantor the balance of their loan on a dark building. So again, but the thing is, the vacant buildings are super cheap. So those are a grand slam when you can get it. And I tell this story. A good friend of mine is big in industrial, and he'll buy vacant buildings constantly. But what looks like a great deal in hindsight, he buys them for 40 a foot. Let's say it's like a 10 or 20,000 square foot building. He puts some improvements, he changes something big, and then he puts a tenant in there, and then he sells it for $150 a foot. And you say, holy cow, that's like printing money. And I say, yeah, but he's all in cash on the building. He's all in cash on the improvements. And up to a certain point, he has no return cash flow. And this might take like 12 months from the time that you closed until you exit. And so there's a lot of nerve and stress, and I would be stressed out so far negative without any cash flow, without any tenant and cash flow generation. So that's the reward for that type of risk. But it's probably not worth the hassle to get a loan on a vacant building, because you're just carrying costs will eat you alive. So again, it's that kind of chicken and the egg. But if you have, call it 2 million liquid on top of your purchase, just buy the building cash, do the improvements, and then wait. And then you can get that home run or grand slam even on a big building that you put a tenant in.
That being said, one of Abe's and Ryan's strategies for their business, they try to get long lease times when they get under contract. So you just pay the option fee of maybe like, I don't know, 10, 20 grand. And you try to get a 3 or 6 month period where you're under contract that you could still back out for a due diligence. Most sellers aren't going to agree to that if they're on the market and they've got a nice building. But if you're purchasing a dark building, one that doesn't have a tenant and their seller's desperate, you have people to squeeze, a longer lead time out of them. And so because you have a 3 to 6 month period where you can find out tenants, you don't actually take on that much risk, because then when you start leasing, you figure out, oh, wow, I'm getting like 12 walkthroughs a day. I'm going to fill this up immediately. Or you figure out, okay, I've gotten one in last month. This is not worth the risk. I'm just going to lose the 10 to 20 grand that I put down as like the deposit, or not deposit, the option fee, and then just walk away from the project because it's not worth it at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's totally valid. I think a lot of people do that to gauge interest, or best case scenario, you could sign a tenant. Like you could get somebody committed to the building before you buy it. And you just have to decide, am I going to order the survey? Am I going to order the phase one? Am I going to, hire my attorney? Those are more chase costs per deal that you have to be willing to walk away from that money in pursuit of the, $1 million profit in 12 months versus kind of slow and steady approach where you have a higher close rate of the deals you go under contract and higher margin versus lower odds per deal. But again, it's all about your strategy, right? Just pick one and just do it based on your risk tolerance and your capital, I guess.
Okay. I'll try not to hold you on since we're about to go over time soon. Lynn asks, how about nursing homes, assisted living? That's like normal tenants. It's not the same as a commercial building. I know we talked briefly about self-storage. You're still trying to bring in tenants who are individuals rather than professional companies, right? Vincent Foy said, slightly unethical life pro tip, call the leasing broker on a comparable property to see what they're asking for rent. This is difficult if you're in a market like Charlotte, though, where you have 1.6% vacancy and there's not very many properties for rent. Namely because if you do the comparison, I think multifamily vacancy is probably like 4 or 5% there. So basically, there's more corporations trying to find space than there are people. JC asks, Ron, anyone, thoughts on a national cell phone carrier like Verizon as a tenant? What do you think about them?
I think I responded. I said I like Verizon. They're great. I actually have a YouTube video about this, but like choosing your retail tenant profile is super, super important because there's a hierarchy of these cell phone stores. And I think Verizon's at the top. AT&T is maybe slightly below them. At the bottom is like Cricket and like Boost and Metro PCS. T-Mobile is probably somewhere in between. Sprint's not around, I guess. It's just T-Mobile. But if they choose you have to make that conscious decision of, can we aim for the fences? Can we go higher? Because they will not want to be in a shopping center next to a donut shop, right? Next to a no name. If it's not a bougie donut, Verizon doesn't want to be next to it. And so you have to choose, do I want this no-named donut shop? And then it's going to preclude you from getting a Verizon. But if that's the highest and best use for your location, that's okay. Take the Metro PCS, take the hair salon, take the fake hair people, the braiding. They make tons of money. Do you know what I'm talking about, Nelson? You probably wear it, like wig stores. But they make tons of money and they take big spaces. But you as a landlord have to decide, is that the profile? Is that the tenant I want to my shop? And it's okay if it is. you know, you throw like the rim store, you do window tinting, you have the hair place. That is like a very synergistic shopping center that place will be packed all the time and your tenants will keep paying rent because it's not a confused identity, if that makes sense. And the worst thing that I can see people do is usually people will wait and they leave vacancies because they want to create a restaurant plus a boba tea plus a, you know, higher end retail boutique plus like a massage place. And that's kind of like a really nice upper class suburban mix. You want good, safe retail places. Batteries and bulbs is a great tenant. You want like maybe not in a signs, but maybe a sign store, two restaurants, maybe a pizza place, and you want to figure out like what are my people coming. The batteries and bulbs is good for daytime traffic. You can do like a coffee shop for morning traffic. Man, there's so much sophistication, and this kind of goes into the Verizon thing. You just got to figure out what's your TI budget and who's your visitor to your center. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. In Austin, there used to be this janky shopping center. It was 20% full at the time, and there's only one tenant that was paying rent, apparently, out of like the 20 spaces that they had available. A bunch of people in LA came and bought the whole shopping center. First tenant they put in, 99 Ranch. Now,
Yeah.
like it's like the Chinatown for Austin, because all they did was bring in one massive grocery tenant, and then all the other tenants followed because they wanted to be near the 99 Ranch. And now the profile is young, college-aged, wealthier, guests, whereas
Tech professionals. Yeah.
professionals,
Yeah.
where it used to be just like a rundown strip mall for a long time. They only
Yeah.
kept one shop, just the hair people that you were talking about. So
They pay a lot. They make tons of money. They have a very high margin business. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff. You know, anchor tenant, I like your example, but the 99 Ranch, it's if you don't have relationships with an anchor tenant, it's I would assume, I mean, there's like 50 people on this call. I almost will assume most of you guys don't have the wherewithal, the connections to bring an anchor tenant like 99 Ranch, but that doesn't change the example. You could bring in, you know, Amy's ice cream, and that can be the catalyst for creating, you know, a Tiff's treats or whatever. That can be your anchor on a smaller scale to creating this, you know, like bougie or, you know, just whatever fancy suburban dessert restaurant, dry cleaner. But anyway, it's again, it's at the end of the day, it's about figuring out a thesis and then buying something and executing. There is no shortcut to that. No matter you're buying office, you're doing industrial, multi-tenant, or retail, just figure out a thesis, learn it, know your tenant's business, and then execute. And you'll make money. You won't lose money. So.
all right, last two questions. We'll run through these quick. Are there any states or cities that are known to be more tenant friendly in commercial real estate?
I think every state is commercial real estate landlord friendly. The only example is, you know, maybe California, and Washington State actually went really, really far during COVID. They paused commercial evictions, which in my mind was insanity. They were the only state, and this was like maybe in King County, only county in the entire country that said businesses that are bringing money in the door, that you're charging money, you don't have to pay your landlord and you can't get kicked out. So these businesses were able to collect money and not have to pay their landlord. That's the only example. And California has some like the ADA lawsuits. I don't know if you've heard about that, but that's federal, but it's worse in California. Every state is commercial friendly. That's just as a rule. Yeah.
And then Annie mentioned long contract times. That's not a long lease time, correct? That is a long due diligence period that allows you to back out if you need to. And then
Yeah.
Ronald's YouTube is Ronald Road Law. You can find him there. How else can we contact you, Ronald, before we call it tonight?
Yeah, I mean, shoot me an email, ron@ronaldrodylaw.com. But website, ronaldrodylaw.com is good. So I appreciate it, guys.
Awesome. Thanks again, everyone, for a good night. And hopefully you guys learned a lot. I sent the project out. If anyone's interested in investing in that project from West Egg Realty. That being said, thank you all for a good night. Let me know if there's any questions. And of course, Ron and Ryan are in the group. Have a good night.